In North American sports, there is no bigger nightmare for a fan base to experience than a losing season where there's no first-round draft pick to look forward to. Today, we're going to look at the history of teams giving up unprotected top 5 picks and being absolutely helpless as they watch another franchise reaping the benefits and maniacally laughing. By my count, there have been 30 unprotected top 5 picks that have been traded in NHL history. That is much more than I was expecting. However, the bulk of these trades happened quite a long time ago. Of these 30 trades, 7 happened in the 60s, 8 took place in the 70s, and 10 occurred during the 1980s. Following the 80s, unprotected picks were traded far less frequently. In the 1990s, only 3 unprotected top 5 picks were traded. In the 2000s, there was only 1 at the very end of it, and in the 2010s, there were exactly 2. So, that begs the question, what exactly were the GMs doing 50 years ago, and why were so many picks traded then? The earliest instances of unprotected draft picks being traded occurred following the 1967 NHL expansion, when the league went from 6 teams to 12 teams. Almost all of these early instances of draft capital being traded involved one of 2 general managers, Milt Schmidt of the Boston Bruins and Sam Pollock of the Montreal Canadiens. Most people saw NHL expansion as an opportunity for the league to earn more revenue, and for other cities to experience hockey. However, Schmidt and Pollock were bloodthirsty, and they saw expansion as an opportunity to feast on the GMs of the newer franchises. The managers of the new franchises had the same attitude towards draft picks that many casual fans have. Why take the potential player a few years down the line over the established player? The expansion franchises had absolutely awful teams, and they were desperate to add good players immediately in order to improve the on-ice product for their fan bases, even at the expense of their first-round picks. Many of these trades were ultimately inconsequential, and it'd take far too long to cover all of them. However, I'd like to talk about a few that had especially disastrous consequences. The first really noteworthy trade involving a first-round pick occurred on October 18, 1967. The Philadelphia Flyers, in their inaugural season as a franchise, decided to swing a deal with the Boston Bruins. The Flyers sent their 1970 first-round pick to the Boston Bruins in exchange for Rosaire Paymont. Paymont was 22 years old and coming off an electric season in the minors, and the Flyers surely thought that trading a pick multiple years into the future wouldn't be a problem. However, Paymont played a combined 46 games and was out of the NHL by 1973. With that first-round pick obtained from the Flyers, the Bruins selected Rick MacLeish, who had a far longer career than Paymont. Interestingly, MacLeish ended up getting traded back to the Flyers and being a big part of their 1974 and 1975 Stanley Cup teams, but the Flyers could have saved themselves a few assets by keeping their pick and drafting MacLeish in the first place. The Flyers were not the only expansion team that was aggressive about trading their draft picks. The Los Angeles Kings made a few moves as well. On May 20th, 1968, the Kings moved their 1970 first-round selection to the Boston Bruins for center Skip Craik, whose career high in points at the time was only 12. This, unsurprisingly, did not work out. Craik was out of the league by 1971, and that first-round pick became Reggie Leach, another player who later became a big part of Philadelphia's mini-dynasty in the mid-1970s. This move was obviously terrible, but I don't even think it was the worst transaction made by the Kings in this general time period. On June 11, 1968, not even a month after the Craik trade, the Kings traded their 1969 and 1972 first-round pick to the Montreal Canadiens for goaltender Gerry Desjardins. That 1969 first-round pick ended up being 5th overall, and Dick Redmond was selected with that pick. Redmond was a top-pairing defenseman in Chicago during the mid-1970s. The 1972 first-round pick, on the other hand, was 5th overall, and Montreal used it to select Steve Shutt. Shutt was one of the most electric goal scorers of his era, and he was a big part of Montreal's 4 consecutive Stanley Cups from 1976 to 1979. Gerry Desjardins, on the other hand, played 2 seasons of hockey for the Kings. After the 1970 season, where we saw multiple top 5 picks surrendered, Sam Pollock was hungry for more. On May 22nd, the Montreal Canadiens traded Ernie Hickey and their 1970 first-round pick, which was 10th overall, to the Oakland Seals for their 1971 first-round pick. With that 10th overall pick that Oakland received from Montreal, they selected Chris Odowson, and he never played a single game for them. Ernie Hickey did become a decent player, but not nearly good enough to justify the price paid. In the 1970-1971 season, the Seals were the worst team in the entire NHL, meaning that they gave up the first overall pick to the Montreal Canadiens. Montreal selected Guy Lafleur with this pick, who was an enormous part of 4 Stanley Cup championship teams. I had spent the entirety of my life thinking that the 70s were just a decade with an absurdly good music library, but now I realize it was also when Sam Pollock held the entire NHL hostage. Pollock did make a few more trades of this nature during his GM career, but none of them had the impact of the Shut and Lafleur moves. The next noteworthy instance of a team shooting themselves in the foot occurred on June 9, 1979. This time, GM Bob Pulford of the Chicago Blackhawks was the beneficiary. Following the merger between the NHL and the WHA, there was a reclaim draft where the NHL teams could reacquire the rights to players they had that were playing in the WHA. Prior to this draft, the Chicago Blackhawks and Quebec Nordiques made a trade. Real Cloutier was a star for the Nordiques in the WHA, and the Nordiques traded their 1980 first-round pick to Chicago in exchange for Chicago agreeing to not select Real Cloutier. Cloutier was a really good player, and was one of the top offensive players in Quebec City for a few years. The Nordiques didn't get completely jobbed in this deal like some of the other ones we've already talked about. However, that 1980 first-round pick ended up being third overall, and the Chicago Blackhawks selected Dennis Savard. Savard had an incredible career. He was the heartbeat of the Blackhawks throughout the 80s, won a Stanley Cup in 1993 with Montreal, and was elected to the Hockey Hall of Fame in 2000. That is more than what Real Cloutier accomplished during his career. Yet another big trade involving draft capital occurred in 1979. In the previous offseason, the Red Wings signed restricted free agent goaltender Rogie Vachon, taking him from the Los Angeles Kings. As Vachon was a restricted free agent, the Red Wings owed the Kings compensation. An arbitrator deemed that forward Dale McCourt would be appropriate compensation, but McCourt refused to report to the Kings. Long story short, this saga ended with McCourt remaining in Detroit, but the Red Wings gave up their 1980 and 1981 first-round picks to the Kings. Vachon only played in Detroit for 2 seasons. The 1980 first-round pick was 4th overall, and the Kings used it to select Larry Murphy, who had a 20-year career with 4 Stanley Cup championships. The 1981 first-round pick ended up being 2nd overall, and the Kings selected Doug Smith with that pick. After taking all of these picks from Detroit, the Kings responded by trading their own draft capital. On March 10, 1981, the Kings traded their 1983 first-round pick and 1983 third-round pick to the Buffalo Sabres in exchange for forward Rick Martin. Martin was a very good player for the Sabres in the 70s, but he had significant injury issues following the trade. He played a total of 5 games for the Kings. LA's 1983 first-round pick was slotted at 5th overall, and the Sabres used it to select Hall of Fame goaltender Tom Barrasso. The decade, at this point, had changed from the 1970s to the 1980s, but a few things remained constant. The Detroit Red Wings were still nonchalantly flinging around their draft picks. On August 21, 1981, the Red Wings sent their 1982 first-round pick to the Minnesota North Stars in exchange for Greg Smith and Minnesota's 1982 first-round pick. It's very rare that teams swap their future draft picks like this. Minnesota was the much better team during the previous season, and Detroit was absolutely terrible, so the Red Wings were clearly banking on improving, at least a little bit, in the 1982 season. That did not happen. The Red Wings were the 2nd worst team in the league. That means that they gave the North Stars the 2nd overall selection in the 1982 NHL draft. Minnesota selected Brian Bellows with that pick. Bellows had a 17-year career, surpassed 1,000 points, and won a Stanley Cup in 1993. Smith had a decent career for Detroit during the mid-1980s, but nothing compared to what Brian Bellows accomplished. The next noteworthy trade was yet another instance of an elite franchise stealing lunch money from an absolutely terrible one. On October 1st, 1981, the Colorado Rockies traded their 1983 first-round pick to the New York Islanders in exchange for Dave Cameron and Bob Lorimer. Lorimer was a good defenseman in New York, but this price was absolutely ridiculous to pay, especially for a team like Colorado that was a consistent bottom feeder. Because of this trade, the Islanders obtained the 3rd overall pick in the 1983 NHL draft, and they used it to select Pat LaFontaine, a future Hall of Famer who extended New York's contention window, and even had an 148-point season under his belt. At this point in NHL history, it appears as if the GMs have learned their lesson, and the irresponsible trades have slowed down considerably. The next instance of an unprotected top 5 draft pick being traded occurred on June 9, 1986. This trade saw the Vancouver Canucks trade their 1987 first-round pick, and Cam Neely, to the Boston Bruins in exchange for Barry Peterson. This trade was actually seen as quite reasonable at the time. Neely was a 1983 first-round pick that had stagnated significantly, and Peterson had some elite seasons under his belt in Boston. However, this trade became an absolute disaster for the Vancouver Canucks. Cam Neely immediately broke out as an elite power forward in Boston, and the Canucks had an absolutely awful season without their pick. Peterson later had major injury issues, and the Canucks never had any sort of substantial team success with Peterson on the team. Due to this trade, the Bruins had the third overall pick in the 1987 NHL draft, and they selected defenseman Glenn Wesley, who had an outstanding NHL career. Fast forwarding a few years into the future now, another horrifying trade took place on October 16, 1989. The Toronto Maple Leafs acquired offensive defenseman Tom Kurvers from the New Jersey Devils in exchange for their 1991 first-round pick. This is a very well-known trade, partially because it involved the Toronto Maple Leafs, but mostly because that 1991 first-round pick ended up being Scott Niedermayer, selected third overall by New Jersey. Niedermayer was a four-time Cup champion, two-time Olympic gold medalist. Tom Kurvers, on the other hand, wasn't even in Toronto for 2 seasons. This is probably the worst investment I've ever seen, aside from my Galaxy AO3S. Miraculously, the heartbreak did not end for Leafs Nation. 6.5 years later, the Toronto Maple Leafs continued to wheel and deal. On March 13, 1996, the Leafs sent Sean Haggerty, Darby Hendrickson, Kenny Johnson, and their 1997 first-round pick to the New York Islanders in exchange for Wendell Clark, Matthew Schneider, and current NHL coach, DJ Smith. One of the most interesting aspects of this trade is that Mike Milbury, GM of the New York Islanders, had regularly been part of the worst GM ever conversations, until Jim Benning, of course, came by and took a stranglehold on that title. Milbury did pretty well here. Kenny Johnson was a regular in the Islander lineup for years, but the big part of this trade was that 1997 first-round pick. That pick turned into Roberto Luongo, so the Leafs gave up 2 future Hall of Famers in a 7-year stretch. That is pretty tragic. The next trade doesn't actually involve the Toronto Maple Leafs. On November 13, 1997, the Florida Panthers sent their 1998 first-round pick and Dave Lowry to the San Jose Sharks in exchange for Viktor Kozlov and a 5th-round pick. Kozlov was the 1993 6th overall pick, and he was having a relatively slow start to his career. Florida took a gamble here. Kozlov was by no means a bum. He had several 50-point seasons and had a long NHL career, but Florida gave up too much. The pick that the Sharks obtained from the Panthers ended up 1st overall. Due to a previous agreement, the Sharks had to send this pick to the Tampa Bay Lightning, who selected Vincent Lecavalier. This means that this trade indirectly bolstered Florida's biggest rival. Now, there are only 3 remaining trades to cover. All 3 of them are already infamous in NHL circles. On September 18, 2009, the Toronto Maple Leafs traded their 2010 first-round pick, 2010 second-round pick, and 2011 first-round pick to the Boston Bruins in exchange for Phil Kessel. The Maple Leafs had a very young team and had spent the last few seasons accumulating high draft picks. At the time of the trade, Toronto's young core consisted of Tyler Bozak, Nazem Kadri, Luke Schenn, Matt Stajan, Mikhail Grabowski, Nikolai Kulemin, and Jonas Gustafsson. Brian Burke has never been afraid of bold moves, and as the GM of the Maple Leafs, he made this Kessel trade in an attempt to find another complementary piece for his group. However, this one worked out quite badly. The Leafs were the second worst team in the 2010 season, and they had to surrender the number 2 selection in the 2010 draft. Brian Burke later went on TSN and had a very mature reaction to this reality. The Boston Bruins used this pick to select Tyler Seguin, who spent many years as a top-line center and is still an active player to this day. The 2011 first-round pick wasn't quite as high, it was only 9th overall, and the Bruins used it to select Dougie Hamilton. Even though Phil Kessel was a very good player for a long time, this trade was a net negative for the Maple Leafs. Toronto had virtually no team success while Kessel was there, and they eventually had to trade him to the Pittsburgh Penguins in a rebuilding move. We are not done with the province of Ontario. The next transaction that we're going to discuss is a rather convoluted one featuring the Ottawa Senators. In the 2017 NHL season, the Ottawa Senators were 1 goal away from a Stanley Cup Finals appearance. Many neutral observers argued that this season was a bit of a fluke, but Senators general manager Pierre Dorion emphatically disagreed, and he decided to make a big move in an attempt to get his team to the next level. On November 5th, 2017, the Senators made a 3-way trade with the Colorado Avalanche and the Nashville Predators. From Ottawa's perspective, that's the one we care about, they gave up Kyle Turris, Shane Bowers, Andrew Hammond, a 2019 third-round pick, and a 2018 conditional first-round pick, in exchange for Matt Duchene. That is a very large package. The Senators were a middle-of-the-pack team, and it was still early in the season, so the decision to trade this first-round pick wasn't seen as that risky. However, the next few years went about as miserably as they possibly could have for Ottawa. Ottawa finished the 2018 season in 30th place in the entire NHL. At the time, that was second to last. Following the draft lottery, the Senators were slated to pick 4th in the 2018 NHL entry draft. Dorion elected to keep this pick and select future captain Brady Tkachuk. Due to the conditions of this trade with Colorado, this meant that Colorado was now in possession of Ottawa's 2019 first-round pick, and there was absolutely nothing that the Senators could do. And somehow, Ottawa's 2019 season was even worse. They finished in last place in the entire league, and they even had to trade Matt Duchene to Columbus for pennies on the dollar. Following the 2019 draft lottery, Colorado was awarded the 4th overall pick, and they selected defenseman Bowen Byram, who later became a big part of their 2022 Stanley Cup championship team. Dorion likely made the right call by keeping the 2018 pick instead of the 2019 one, but this trade, regardless, is firmly on the Mount Rushmore of awful Dorion transactions. Now, we know Ottawa sucks in 2019, but why exactly were they so horrible? Well, the main reason they were so bad is the next trade we're going to talk about. Following that terrible 2018 season that Ottawa had, the Senators were faced with quite a predicament. Elite defenseman Erik Karlsson was 1 year away from being an unrestricted free agent, and he was also rapidly approaching 30 years old. On September 13th, 2018, the Senators traded Erik Karlsson to the San Jose Sharks. In return, they received many different things, including Josh Norris, Chris Tierney, Dylan DeMello, and several conditional draft picks. The big pick that Ottawa extracted from this trade was San Jose's 2020 first-round draft pick. There were some other weird conditions with this trade, but the pick that Ottawa got was the 2020 first from San Jose. This trade made sense for San Jose as well. Erik Karlsson was likely the league's best defenseman at the time of the transaction, and Sharks general manager Doug Wilson was desperate to get a Stanley Cup out of his core that had gotten close in so many of the previous seasons, and it seemed like this San Jose core was just never going to decline. They were so good for so long. In the first season following this trade, the 2018-2019 season, everything went approximately as expected for San Jose. They had a very good regular season and a deep playoff run, making it to the Final Four before ultimately being knocked out by the St. Louis Blues. But the next season saw the Sharks rapidly implode. Many of their older players abruptly fell off a cliff, and the Sharks were in the bottom 5 of the NHL standings at the time of the NHL ceasing operations due to COVID. The Ottawa Senators held San Jose's pick, so it's almost like they got that pick back that they traded to Colorado. By the time the NHL draft arrived, the Senators were slated to pick 3rd overall, and they eventually drafted franchise center Tim Stützle. I suspect no conditions were attached to this pick during the trade because neither GM saw this outcome as a remote possibility. Since the Erik Karlsson trade, there have been no other instances of a team surrendering a top 5 unprotected draft pick. In general, we've seen increased caution among NHL general managers, and basically every traded first-round pick these days involves comprehensive conditions that are longer than the entire Declaration of Independence. Even in these recent examples that we've analyzed, the trades were far more sensible than the ones that were occurring in the 60s and the 70s. This level of caution is probably better for the executives, but it's far less fun for the fans and neutral observers. This was a really fun video to make. Let me know what you think the worst of these trades was. Take care.